First, it's an honor to be here. I thank everyone for inviting us to make our presentation. And I want to thank especially Or Levy, Amir Bornstein, and Serena. Now, before I ask you to lend me your ears, let me tell you that I'm thanking Serena for lending me her eyes. And so what we'll do is Serena will read the key points of my PowerPoint, since I can't see what's on the screen right now, nor can I see very well here. Then I will use what she says to hit my talking points. Thank you very much. Okay. And, before we start, however, let me say one thing. I've always said that I have a love-hate relationship to radar and electronic surveillance. As an Israeli, and we know full well that it is radar and all the new systems that give us the warning times of 15 to 30 to 45 to 60 seconds between the launching of a missile aimed at destroying our civilian populations and the time needed for our civilian populations to reach their shelters and hiding places. So for us, radar is an existential thing. And these missiles are intended to destroy and kill our civilian population. So that is the context of everything I say about radar. Having said that, I, as an environmental and occupational physician, have a responsibility to do everything possible to protect those manning these systems who are protecting us. That's the ethical equation here. Okay, we're on.
Okay, so Dr. Richter will be presenting on Sentinel case series of cancer patients with occupational exposures to electromagnetic, non-ionizing radiation, and other agents.
Yeah, now this is
puzzling case.
Yeah, this is a work that goes back many, many years. Our work on this entire problem was energized by people knocking on my door. I'm an occupational physician. And people walking in and saying, hey, I have a cancer, and I worked in a military position, and I had exposures to radio frequency. So, okay, now what happened is that through the years, people would walk in with their stories, and I, as an occupational medicine doctor, love to take histories. I also like to schmooze. So we would talk a lot and would get very detailed information on the circumstances of work, use, and exposure. Near field, midfield, far field, short, long, adjacent, intermittent, continuous, day, night, 24 hours, 12 hours. And in all our stories, the patient's stories were often very typical. Many of these people would work 24/7 for many, many days under intense pressure, for example. And these kinds of bits of information were very important to us in guiding our insights as to whether or not there's something that's going on in relating the exposures to their outcomes. Go ahead. A troubling case, yeah?
So age of 18 with ELF and RF microwave radiation. 6-week latency.
Glioblastoma? What was the tumor?
No, it doesn't say.
I think it was a glio.
With electromagnetic as a promoter and trigger for existing latent situation.
Yeah, here we have an example of a very short latency. Very, very puzzling. But again, the case poses the question of what's the interaction between exposures as promoters as well as initiators. Go ahead.
This is just the abstract of a paper written by Dr. Richter.
And others.
And Tamar and others. Brain cancer with induction periods of less than 10 years in young military radar workers.
This is a paper published in Archives of Environmental Health where we noticed that there were quite a few individuals with brain cancer, but whose latencies were less than 10 years, which is the received conventional wisdom as to the minimal latency period required for induction. However, when I check the pathological literature, when the parameter 10 years was cited, the authors always said, well, this is the average period of latency? Well, average means there are some who may be under as well as those who may be more. Question. Go ahead next, please.
Ellie, did you have information on these patients, on their cell phone use, on their residency near base stations?
We asked all those questions. There was nothing, by and large, there was nothing terribly remarkable. Keep in mind that many of these cases began coming to us prior to the massive explosive use in the increase of cell phones. This is work going all the way back to the late 1980s or so. Now, we also published a paper suggesting the hypothesis that the brain may be the antenna and the cell phone, the receiver, the head is the antenna and the brain is the receiver for use of cell phones, given the specific metrics of the wavelengths, which are 900 megahertz and 1800 megahertz, which are precisely the diameters times half and 2 of the radius of the skull. This was an idea by Zvi Weinberger. People have challenged the idea, but I presented this slide today because there's been a lot of talk about different cells and different tissues serving as antennae. So I thought we should throw this in to share with you as part of our discussion. Go ahead.
This is the brain cancer distribution. 3 glioblastoma, 2 astrocytoma, and 1 meningioma.
This is when? Sorry?
From the first paper you presented.
Oh yeah, from the very first one. Yeah, no, the first paper which was just published. Yeah.
Paper on the brain series.
Yeah. And now we'll get to the big one. Go ahead. All right. Now this is the really big slide. This slide summarizes the latent periods for the tumors in a case series of 47 patients. 47, 48? Pardon? 47. This was the paper published in the European Journal of Oncology. The history of the paper is rather interesting. It all was the consequence of a meeting over coffee. Everything happens over coffee. Between Mirando Sofriti and me in India, of all places. And I told Mirando about this case series we had. And I said I was very reluctant to publish because we didn't have a denominator. We never had access to a population at risk of persons with exposures. Not that we didn't try. In the late 90s, we had gone to the state controller and later on to the Knesset, our parliament, calling for epidemiologic monitoring of persons with exposures to non-ionizing radiation. Both the state controller and the Knesset parliamentary committee, which oversees the state controller, endorsed our recommendations for cohort studies, but the recommendations were never followed up. Now, so we went, but Sofriti, Mirando, said, well, listen, the observations are extremely important. Science starts with observations. Report your observations and throw them out there. So we did that. And here were the latent periods for the different kinds of tumors we had in our case series and the N for the tumor types on the right side of the bars. Now, what are these? This is testes,
First
right?
is testis.
The first was testes. How many years?
It's 5.
5 years.
5 years with
Latency,
6
average
patients.
latency. Yeah, next.
Hematolymphatic with
Yeah.
19 patients at 7 years.
And then?
And then other organs such as GI tract,
Yeah.
lung, breast, liver,
Another, yeah.
prostate, 8 patients, 6-year latency.
And then down.
Brain with the meninges only and 9 patients, 10 years.
Okay,
And
so,
then head and neck.
okay, now, what we had here was interesting because we had, our data were standardized by the, for onset of exposure, which was dictated by the fact that we knew when everyone went into their military duty period. They all went in roughly at the ages of 18 or 19, so we could standardize for onset of exposure. Now, what was interesting here was the varying periods of latency by tumor type. Now, what struck me is that there was a certain coherence between the length of the latency and the type of tumor. We would expect testes to be very short. We would expect hemolymphatic to be very short. We would expect solid tumors to be much, much longer. And this is indeed what we found. Now, is this an argument consistent with or suggestive or supportive of a case for cause effect? I can't say. But let me ask the counterfactual what-if question. What if, let's say, the latent periods for the hematolymphatic cases were 15 or 20 years, and for head and neck and brain, 2 to 3 years, in relation to onset of exposure? We would then say, well, that's not really very plausible. That's not really very coherent. That's not really consistent with prior knowledge about what we know about the biology of the tumors. So we posed that question in our conclusions in the paper which we published for in the European Journal of Oncology. If you wish, we had a case series study which now morphed into a case kind of study, where we're comparing different kinds of cases in relation to their exposure period, their latencies. Next, please.
This explains the different specificities of civilian, military, and EHS patients.
I can't quite see it. What?
So the civilian patients had adenocarcinoma of left large cell carcinoma.
Yeah.
58 years of age, a female.
Yeah. These were after? This is after, pardon?
After all others.
Okay. This table shows data on additional cases of cancer not in our paper, because what happened is that after we published, people kept on knocking on the door. And by the way, when people knock on the door, they may have a suspicion as to the relationship of their tumor to their exposure, but I don't think they're that sophisticated to know, I have a glioblastoma as opposed to meningioma, or so on and so forth. And I don't think they're that clever and foxy to figure out, hi, the latencies are consistent with what's known in prior knowledge. So there's a funny fit here. And people, between latency and what people were telling us as they randomly knocked on our door. Go ahead.
Do you want me to go through all of
No.
them?
These were additional tumors,
Okay.
not in our paper or presenting later on. The paper kept on coming. Now, next.
This is the Smigelski.
Zizmelski.
paper of
Now,
2001.
we owe a great deal in Israel to the mighty work of Stanislav Zizmelski. We tried to contact him. We don't even know if he's still with us in this world. But he, over the years, was generous in supplying us with knowledge, information, theoretical material, a huge amount of work he did on exposure modeling for people in radar in the Polish military, both in communication and in surveillance. Mighty work, beautiful work, and we have those papers in our archives. And what we noticed, and I have to thank Michael Pelig for the insight, is that the proportional distribution of the tumors in our case series roughly corresponded to the proportional distribution of cases in Zizmelski's paper, which does not deal with latency, but just plain old-fashioned risk based upon a cohort he was able to define. Am I correct, Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That was another interesting, curious fit. In other words, we had internal coherence in regard to latency and external coherence in relation to a prior study, in my opinion, one of the most interesting studies ever done. Later on, there were other studies more or less confirming, showing similar findings, notably from De Grave in Belgium. Next, please.
Ellie, there's 5 more minutes.
Oh, we'll be there.
This
Easily.
is the graph of the multiple primaries. And
Now, another very important finding is that six of our 47 patients had multiple primaries. Now, the Connecticut Cancer Registry has data on what the likelihood of multiple primaries are in relation to all tumors. I suggest that the ratio of multiple primaries to all tumors, to those with one tumor, is an interesting indicator of possible something. And if you calculate the odds ratios here for the multiple primaries in our case series compared to what would be expected from the Connecticut Tumor Registry, it's an extremely high risk. And I asked Dr. Miller to perhaps explore, beginning to raise the question of what what happens with multiple primaries and cohorts of risk? This is a question which is a toughie, and over the years as I tried to raise this question with various statisticians, most didn't want to touch it. The only one who did was the late Eric Peretz, and then sadly he died. Go ahead, next please.
These are your conclusions. So first,
Read.
Case for cause-effect relationship supported by 1, prior knowledge in animal and epidemiology studies.
You've heard all that.
2, coherent relationship between tumor types and latencies.
Yeah.
3, multiple primaries in many patients,
Good.
like you said, 6 out of 47.
Yeah.
And similar proportional distribution for tumors, in our case, series compared to Snigelski.
Yeah, okay, go. Zizmelski.
Zizmelski.
Go ahead.
It's too many consonants all in one.
You're not Polish. See, my father came from Poland, so shame on you.
So the big question, so what?
So what? Yes. Now, several so whats. I've come to the end, Deborah. I have 1 minute?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Pardon? Okay, yeah, and I'm going to call Amir Bornstein to come up as well. Please do. I am concerned about the need for prevention and protection of those people who are protecting us. I do not believe we're doing the utmost. I cannot go into all the details why, because we're dealing with sensitive material. But it's clear that there is a problem. And with all the limitations of our case series and our case model built into our case series, I think there's some, I suggest that our findings suggest there's a case for action. Amir Bornstein has done a lot of shoe leather industrial field work to look at exposure conditions here and there in insensitive places. He's wearing his Faraday jacket and Faraday cap. There's no such precautions are not routine throughout our security, those dealing with radar electronic equipment. And this is a troubling question for me. I am uncomfortable with this situation. I should add that there much more could be done to link the findings on exposure as defined by, or potential exposure as defined by job exposure matrices and outcome. Every person in Israel in any kind of work with electronic equipment has a number describing his job. 1 is a bookkeeper, 2 is a baker, 3 is a candlestick maker, 4 is an electronic technician. I believe we have to start making the linkages between all the 4s and their outcomes, and their comparisons. What else do I have here?
You have better prevention and protection, and go from precaution to prevention.
Yes, I think we've reached the point. There's enough of a body of knowledge now to say we're already going beyond mere precaution. I think we're talking about a much stronger case for prevention of what appear to be known risks from known exposures. That's my own point of view. I made this point in a presentation in Taipei in 2009. I have a long PowerPoint going into that point. And by the way, Zizmelski and I, funny story, when I was at his place, he's a wonderful guy, and at 11 o'clock in the morning, he pulled out a big bottle of brandy. He said, now we're going to work. I said, well, I'm not used to, I'm Jewish, and we're not used to heavy drinking. I said, it's going to confuse me. I won't be able to think clearly. He said, no, it'll make you think more clearly. So he pours a big bottle, and I have to drink, of course. And then the two of us turned out a memorandum, which I sent to Deborah a few months ago. And I have to say, it was one of the clearest memorandums I ever wrote in my life. So, pardon?
Under the influence.
Under the influence. And Deborah wrote me back. She didn't know about the alcohol. And she complimented on us for thinking ahead, because we were ready. Zizmelski, with all of his basic research, was already going heavy into biomarkers. But he was 10 years ahead of his time, 15 years ahead of his time, in terms of development of biomarkers. And so there we are. That's one informal recommendation from the presentation. Thank you. Questions? Amir. I'm going to give Amir 30 a minute.
Yes.
Seconds.
Yeah.
Okay.
What we have here is a wireless microphone which emits radiation. I'm going to put it here. Hopefully it will work with an ambient even. This is RF meters.
Talk loud, more loudly.
Those are RF meters.
Yeah, here, I'll give them this mic.
No, not the wireless one. Let's take this one. Okay. For a second. Those are RF meters. Home use RF meters. Pretty fast sampling rate. And I'm going to try to show that the jacket is working. Okay? And let's try it first with the ambient and then with the microphone. You can see the level here. Now, can you hear it? Okay. This is the RF. Now I'm going to put it for a couple of seconds here. Okay. This is the sounds coming probably from the microphone. Now, this is another better one. Okay? This is a kind of a weak signal. Deck phone are stronger, Wi-Fi router usually are stronger, cell phone which you put in the field are stronger, cell towers are stronger. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amir, and I'm grateful to Amir for constantly keeping after
Ellie,
us.
can you comment on the paradox about cell phones and towers, about how your signal is strong when you're close to the tower?
Sure,
but
sure.
the cell phone signal into you is weaker?
The farther you are, the farther you are from the cell phone,
Microphone.
I'm sorry, the farther you are from the far field antenna, the nearer, the stronger the signal put out by the cell phone in the near field to compensate for the weakness of the connection. I'm a little foggy on the physics of the relationship and the reverse feedback loops, but there indeed were studies showing correlations between distance and increased risk for tumors associated with near field exposure, and I think that paradox was exploited by Segal in her work on parotid tumors, where she went to the people using cell phones where the antenna was far away. In other words, a higher near field exposure.
So, may I ask a question?
I should ask one point. In our case, we had people enveloped in micro environments, cluttered with extremely dense electromagnetic radiation of all sorts and all frequencies, including ELF and RFMW. Most of our cases were mostly RFMW, but we had cases with ELF as well. They were working with a near field equipment right close to them, sometimes attached to the body, and indeed we had one patient with a bowel tumor who wore a pack emitting radiation on his backside. And then there are people in which they have what I call a meso field, the intermediate field of equipment all around them in a very, very cluttered set of work environment. Then, of course, there were those with exposures from the far field, and there were those with exposures to all three kinds of situations, exposure scenarios. So, yes. And this kind of information was only possible to obtain through detailed, tedious interviewing, much of which Or Levy did and Tamar Berman did and Yael Stein did in her day. And I don't think the classic mainframe big mega studies capture all this richness of detail. I became rather skeptical and cynical about many of these studies and their power to pick up this kind of richness of detail.
Question
Elihu,
Ellie, question over here.
Charles?
how much luck have you had with health promotion for those people who are protecting us within the IDF, within the Army? How do they really respond when you say, look, I have a case series?
Well, I meet them in court, and they clobber us, and they pick us apart, and it's always interesting to walk into these courtroom scenes where I walk in, and then the other side walks in with a battery of lawyers, 5 or 6 lawyers, batteries of cartons, going back to every detail in my life for many, many, many years. So so there is a response.